Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Heather Canlis Rigg, and I'm the Curatorial resident at Gallery TPW in Toronto. I'm joined here by Jessie Chun, whose solo exhibition is currently on view. And we're going to walk you through her exhibition and do a bit of a conversation about her exhibition and her practice at large. Jessie, thank you for joining us.
For having me. Hi, my name is Jessie Chun, and I am an artist based in New York and currently in Paris for a project.
So maybe we can start by talking about the title of your exhibition, which I actually myself cannot pronounce in full. I refer to it amongst the staff, we refer to it as the title being And Verse Cosmos, but that is, but there's another aspect to the title that is in Korean, and I'm not a Korean speaker or reader or writer, so it is inaccessible to me in many ways. So we thought we would start by talking about that. So maybe you can share that with us.
Yeah, the title of the show is And Verse, 혼잣말의 언어 그리고 cosmos. And 혼잣말 means utterance to self, self-utterance, and 언어 means language, and 그리고 means and. So it's and verse, the language of self-utterance, and cosmos. And it was important for me that parts of it remained in Korean, as the word 혼잣말 was, it's actually a word that I find to be untranslatable in English because, I guess technically it could be a monologue, and I've used monologue in a title for previous work, but to me, monologue has more of a theatrical connotation and nuance. And I think that 혼잣말 in Korean is a very sort of like private utterance, like a whisper under your breath kind of feeling, where you're just talking to yourself, and it's a very interior kind of space. And so I wanted to keep the word as it is because it can't be translated. And I think that often, I've done like Sule, for instance, like the title is in Korean and English, but for me, in the subtext of the title, in the brackets, it was 혼잣말의 언어 그리고 cosmos, and cosmos was in English and is in English. And so, and I think that that's kind of very natural for people who are in between languages, who kind of come from a diasporic background, like you're thinking sometimes in two languages and then they merge and then they become broken and they become like strange, like you make up words. And so for me, it was kind of also embracing that kind of diasporic condition of language, and also just being okay with presenting the untranslatable and not always having to be transparent or translatable, and just kind of remaining that sort of opacity for myself.
And this sort of diasporic approach to language, which is very much sort of underpins, your practice in various ways and to various degrees, definitely is underpinning Shule. Shule is both a single and a 3-channel video. We have the single channel on view at TPW, and it was my exposure to this film that sort of started my relationship with Jessie, and I was very much interested in, as Jessie said, this diasporic approach to language and thinking about sound and audibility, which is so much a part of course, language, and the work that Jessie does. Shule sort of holds all of that through the repetition of consonant sounds, of English consonant sounds that Jessie's collaged together in a way that really speaks to sort of practicing a new language or another language that you're not familiar with. And it really brings out this sort of like embodied element to it through the sounds that you're hearing. And these are all culled from YouTube, as well as the visuals that you're seeing. Jessie plays with Hangul and English and numbers throughout the video. So you're seeing these circular formations repeat and disappear across the screen as you're listening to this, which I found very beautiful and really interesting. And I love the way Shule is installed in the space because it's very immersive. You're definitely immersed in these sounds. So maybe, if you could talk a little bit about, that work and putting it together. It brings, so many different elements of your practice in terms of physical sort of hardship, so to speak, of learning another language, but it also brings in this other beautiful element, which is gangang shule, which is a Korean women's, what we refer to as a moon dance, which is done during the harvest, during the Korean harvest, once a year under the full moon. It's only women who come together to do this dance. And there's a sort of a beautiful analogy between the O's and the zeros that Jessie plays with on the screen in this video with gangang shule, because it's based on circularity and togetherness through women either holding hands or touching shoulders and always moving around in a formation that's always a circle. So this is sort of also exemplified by the fact that this is done during a full moon. So you have all these wonderful and wondrous sort of forms and ceremony that sort of come together here. And what I've loved about this film is that this dance sort of acts as sort of like, for me, a remedy to this sort of like harshness of this other, language sort of assimilation. But anyway, I've said a lot now about this video. So maybe just if you could just speak a bit more about it.
I mean, I think you really touched upon a lot of the things that, I was thinking about. And also for me, the thing that really drew me to the dance was the fact that it was also used as a means for women at that time when the dance began, which was, predicted to be thousands of years ago. But it, during when it was definitely practiced in like various dynasties, pre-colonial periods in Korea, this was the one time like in a year that women were allowed to just shout and like make sound and unleash silenced anger, as they called it. So, there was such power in these women, not just coming together, but also just like unleashing to collectively. And, so they shout and they improvise the lyrics. And there's like the chorus that, they repeat, which is 강강술래. And then, people go around and say different things. And so depending on the region, it's different too, because it's oral tradition. So as you know, it's like, not as documented and archived in a way that, written language is. And so I found that element really beautiful. And also there's a myth that I think is sort of confirmed, but not totally confirmed. Like everyone has different school of thought on it. But they say that during Imjinwaran, when Japan was trying to invade Korea, the general at the time actually gathered the women to do kangangsule to scare off, people from invading from Japan, the Japanese invaders from coming in at the time. And I just think that that's so interesting to think of sound as also the sort of way to protect yourself and what language can do. And, there's always like that violence of language, but also there's such, like you said, like maybe there's like a remedy or there's another type of, there are various registers that I think language can, operate on. And so I think in this exhibition, I was really interested in thinking about not just the socio-political or the diaspora cultural, but also the kind of interior, personal, and like a spiritual interiority of language. And so Sule, I think for me, it was really thinking about like how, what is the embodiment of these sounds, and what is, like, for me, it was sort of a metaphor to unlearn these ideologies of English and ideologies of lunar colonization, like these really specific hierarchical narratives about the moon, and thinking of ways to, can I undo that sort of colonial narrative about the moon? And for me personally, I think it kind of, I drew from my memory of doing the dance, and my grandmother was a Korean folk traditional dancer. So I think that it just, whenever for myself, when I was trying to unlearn these narratives, when I look at the moon, I kept thinking about this dance. And so, that's sort of how Sule just kind of came together.
You refer to Sule as this collective unleashing, which is so beautiful. And as you said, sort of sound as protection and remedy. In Sule, we don't actually hear the women sing, that isn't part of the video. So although we watch it, we don't hear it. We do hear, Korean folk drumming, which is one of my favorite parts, when that happens. So maybe you could talk about that, your decision not to include the women's voices.
I think that, I know you've watched the UNESCO video of like Kangangsule. Like, I think for me, there's like a fine line that I personally practice, that's like, that I try to, where I don't want the work to become derivative, or like, it's not meant to be like informative thing of this tradition or ritual. Like for me, I think it was really important to reinterpret it in my own way. And I think part of it is also like holding back on certain information. Maybe I think in my head, because I was making Kangang Sule into something else. And that's why the title of the piece is Sule and not Kangang Sule, because Sule is like my own sort of like my own unlanguaging ritual video that came together. So I think that it was important that the sound, instead of it being this folk song that unleashes their woes at the time, like it was, for me, I made it during the thick of the beginning of the pandemic when, there was a lot of, there still is, especially in America, a lot of Asian hate and, just not even feeling safe to, leave the apartment or go on the subway, which I sadly, like my friends and I are still feeling right now. So I think for me, the kind of breathy sounds of like undoing English into like voiceless and voiced consonants, the sh, those sounds. And then for me, that was my song. So that was like my unleashing, and hopefully it was my unleashing for, other people who were feeling those things at the time. And so it was, I think in some weird way, I think a lot of what I'm doing is kind of authoring disparate, like fragmented contemporary folklore, maybe maybe it's a diasporic folklore. And so I think that it was also just more authentic to myself to make the work not be authentically Kangang Sule.
One aspect of the film is the repeating shh, which is that in itself has so much to unpack in terms of being a form of silencing, but also being a form of consoling, which I think, really resonates in what you're saying, which is lovely. And even just like the women coming together to unleash and for collective unleashing. So just to, as a form of another form of consolation is really lovely. And yeah, and maybe we can talk about a little bit about lunar colonization, which is something that you point to in different ways throughout your practice and thinking, and then maybe this is a place for us to talk about documents and bureaucratic documents, which you sort of erase and rewrite and sort of retranslate with poetry and abstraction. And this has been something that you're doing throughout your practice in different ways. Some earlier work was, looking very formally and sort of more literally, I would say, at documents and erasing what was there and reducing them to, sort of more graphic formal shapes. And now it's, sort of shifted into a much more abstracted, poetic, in terms of their sort of like materiality and sort of cosmology. So I just want to talk about that, the documents themselves and sort of their relationship to sort of migration and immigration and their links to sort of bureaucratic control and surveillance, but also to, as you already touched on, like colonial narratives. So control in terms of not only people, but also in terms of like the moon and sort of just the absurdity of colonial and imperial forces trying to, conquer or own or know.
Or militarize.
Militarize the moon. And so there's all these links between like something so as macro as, the moon and the universe. And then as micro is like how we breathe and speak and, move about the world individually. So yeah, maybe I'll let you speak a bit more about that.
I think my strange obsession / like practice of undoing bureaucracy came from my own experience of like having been an immigrant in multiple countries and having this like piece of paper literally validate my entire existence. And so you become like very afraid of losing it or having an error or having a typo or having, it's like this piece of paper is what enters you into a place and what validates your life. And so I kind of have like PTSD from that too, but in that way, I think it became really therapeutic to be able to shift those narratives. And I think, growing up in Hong Kong during the British colonial period, learning English as a second language there, and, just literally witnessing the handover and living through the colonial and post-colonial at the same time, like within a day, literally. I think that a lot of those things really shaped my awareness of these bureaucratic documents and symbols, and like current, for instance, like the Hong Kong dollar, like Queen Elizabeth disappeared, and then these other things came together, like new flags came, and during the handover, like Prince Charles was handed, like this Chinese soldier folds the British flag and gives it to Prince Charles. He takes it and like goes on the boat and like waves goodbye, and this whole like performance really of like bureaucracy, I think, in this kind of colonial control is something that I think, because I grew up with it, I was just so aware of it. And then, moving to different places and then kind of going through these processes and then trying to figure out what it means to like, I guess, understanding what it means to speak this language that I'm speaking, or to not speak another language that I can speak, but also that I'm losing. And yeah, so I think I've always been really interested in the relationship to like the written word. What does it mean when something is documented or historicized or institutionalized? So I think that's why my interest in the relation between language and linguistic hierarchies and histories and bureaucracy, like that kind of, to me, that was always like entangled. I never saw them as separate things. And so, and I think that in my work, I often think that I'm kind of playing the role of a translator. And so I'm always working from a point of departure, like from a very specific place, which is the found narrative, which is usually from found documents. And so, yeah, I was always interested in whether it's how a person is, validated via like bureaucracy or the English language, which is the world's like global lingua franca. And this is the language that everyone needs to be translated through in order to be validated and across borders or, wherever. So yeah, for me, it was just really important to think about those things. And I think naturally, like from thinking about like earthly bodies and how we're controlled, to it just kind of naturally went to the celestial bodies and how, these colonial desires to own them, like you said, or like to know them, or to, to militarize or to control, like it, to me, just felt really, it's absurd, but at the same time, it's just so real, like those kind of human greed. And so, yeah, I think for me, it was just a natural progression of looking at those sort of narratives that exist, which to me are, yeah, it's both here and there and together, like coexisting. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned sort of losing language. Yes, and I just wanted to sort of bring up this concept of losing language. Yeah, maybe you can talk about how you think about that specifically in your work in terms of wanting to maintain, like this first languages, early languages, mother tongue, familiar languages that you lose in this sort of need to be able to move forward in these like, colonialist capitalist environments by, speaking English and then thinking English, and it's sort of like taking over. And we've talked about language being whole and language being incomplete, and sort of moving back and forth between those things. And through talking, we've kind of thought about like, notions of the moon in terms of the moon's waxing and waning, and the moon is always there fully, but we can only ever sometimes we can only access a really small part of it. So for me, that became like a very literal analogy to like more fully talk about what we mean by language being both whole and incomplete. And anyway, so maybe you could speak a bit about that.
I mean, I love that you referred to that phrase, like language being whole, which came from like a letter that I wrote to the US government about my grandmother for the book, Best Letters from Asian Americans in the Arts. And yeah, Heather referenced that like line that I wrote about like how before I left Korea, how like language felt whole, or I spoke one language and it felt whole. And then you wonderfully like used that and took it on in a different way for the essay for the exhibition, which I really loved. Yeah, I don't know what I mean by that. I honestly don't know, but I think that as I as my Korean continues to get worse, just because I lack the opportunities to speak it, like I only speak it with my parents, and then, they're like in Korea and we don't get to see each other that much. And so it's something I'm literally trying to hold on to somehow by either trying to read or like watch Korean shows. And I mean, I feel like there's this sense of like longing sometimes to fully speak that language or to fully understand. And I felt really frustrated even not being able to talk about my work in Korean when I was like doing a show in Korea. And then it makes you really realize like I've had to go through such assimilation that I've just sort of lost this part of myself, and I guess, for me, I'm just trying to remember that like to me, they're equally important. And I mean, I think that I'm not trying to like, I don't know. It's just like something I feel like, because I'm living through it every day. It's like, it's hard for me to like analyze what it means. So I don't know, but I think that it's sort of this like in between that I just want to embrace like as like a equally valid space, because I think that for diasporic communities, it's so like a lot of people exist in that in between. And I think that when we talk about language and like, especially in visual art, I think that when I see a lot of text-based work, it's always like in English. And I guess sometimes naturally I'm thinking about, like visualizing the untranslatable space. And that's also a very equally valid and important sort of space. And I think you and I've talked about Emily Apter before, but Emily Apter wrote a book called Against World Literature, Politics of Untranslatability. But so I like how she talks about the violence of translation also, and how untranslatability in that space is also equally valid. And like I just think that maybe in a lot of my work, that's what I'm also trying to do, is to really just kind of like to materialize or to visualize or embody those spaces.
And maybe this is a nice time to sort of shift to the new work that is in TPW, which is the same title as the exhibition, but what precedes it is the word sijo, which is a type of sort of an ancient form of Korean poetry that's still practiced today. It often traditionally did reference sort of like bucolic references and also cosmological references, which really has nice resonances for your work, Jessie. And while in Gallery TPW, there's two main rooms, and the larger room is dedicated to Shule. The work in this room for me, and we've talked about it being a bit more interior and individual. It's a space for sort of, we've talked about as being sort of more of a space for meditation and reflection, and perhaps points to the title, I think, in a different way than Shule does. And we also have in that room like literal sort of documents in terms of document-sized mirrors, which are on the floor with, your own sort of what we refer to as your own sort of lexicon and syntax that you've developed through, your drawings, which are scores, but where you sort of unravel the English alphabet, which we'll talk more about later, and then also through your use of grids, which sort of, subtly reference, bureaucratic documents and knowing and knowledge, as well as other imagery, including like smoke and clouds, and the moon. That's again sort of like, for me, the first thing that you see when you walk into this room is another circle made, it's on the floor, it's made with rocks, and that's what the mirrors lie on. And then you have sort of a moon that waxes and wanes, if I'm going to say that again, in the corners. And there's a lot of repetition. There's graphite there. But yeah, maybe I'll let you talk about this a little bit, and just to add to that, and perhaps this would be a nice place to also talk about shijo more, this form of poetry. And while poetry has definitely always been a part of your practice, maybe you could tell us a bit more about this sort of specific shift to this type of poetry and what that means for you, and if you want to share like how that's playing into your work going forward.
I think I started thinking about shijo because I have been really interested in studying more into Korean like folk music and oral tradition, which Kangangsul is a part of. And a lot of Korean folk singing, like pansori and like chang, they're actually a form of storytelling. And they often cite shijos. And so shijo, it's began as a form of, sort of minimal poetry during, I think, like Joseon dynasty and other dynasties. And then it's still practiced now, but I like that it also kind of is a form of oral tradition, and that they all are kind of, interweave together. And some of the earlier authors of shijo, like even though it began as a, as always in Korea, it was like an elite male kind of activity. It did shift for a bit to Korean kisangs, who were like Korean like women performers and entertainers who like also wrote shijos, and then some female poets came out of that who were recognized. And so, and I think also just being someone from, both, like, I mean, I guess being from the Korean diaspora, I started to actually think that instead of rooting my work in only Western traditions, which I don't think I've ever done like consciously, but I think that when you exist in the West, people just contextualize you there, right? So for me, it was important to actually think of new contexts for myself. And I think that, despite my being wherever I am, like I can extend on these traditions that become part of me, or that are part of me that maybe I, wasn't always aware of, or that I was aware of that I didn't know how to practice, because I always felt like that's not truly authentic because I am not there and I didn't learn how to properly cite a shijo. But I think that, like you wrote so wonderfully in the essay, like these traditions also sort of kind of remain within, like archived within. And like, so I kind of wanted to access these things that are like internal and interior to me. And yeah, and shijo felt really just sort of like a nice way to put together these sort of, I feel like all my new like video sculptures that I've been making with mirror projections and rocks that I'm continuing right now, I feel like they're all part of like the same family, and that they all seem like almost like a verse each. So it made sense to sort of give it a name that they can all share. And then there's like the subtext that's like in brackets, and they have their own names. And so, yeah, I think it's just sort of natural. Like I wasn't like planning on these things, but they just kind of, just merged together. And I think that Korean spirituality is something I've been kind of engaging with in the last few years, like more deeply. And that's also sort of my own personal unlearning that I've been doing. And yeah, and I'm really interested in, for the last few years, I've been kind of using Korean shamanistic or folkloric narrative as a way to complicate the colonial narrative and to take it into another place as I mistranslate and abstract. So it just felt natural to kind of tie it all together.
And in terms of spirituality, yeah, there's sort of a nice sort of this like there's a verticality to it that's a really nice sort of, which is this verticality, yeah, it's this nice sort of subtle reference to Southeast Asian landscape traditions, which were vertically oriented, thinking about scrolls, and just that in contrast to Western landscapes that are of course horizontal and have their own sort of reference points in terms of viewpoint, which is very different. So I love that about it. And there's also this sort of verticality and scrolling. I could see it more, even though I always knew it was there. So that was really nice for me. And I love the way that we have these, vertical, sort of tall, skinny mirror projections that are in the corners. And what's literally mirrored that with those is when you walk into the gallery, Jesse's created these graphite rubbings that mimic that. And I don't know, for me, there's a nice sort of like entryway, like portal into that room, but also, a nice sort of note in repetition. And so, yeah, I wonder if you could talk a bit about the graphite rubbings and also I started this sort of rant off about talking about spirituality. So also about, sort of, gentle nods to sort of like a Buddhist garden. I don't know if I go too far by maybe saying that. And we've also talked about mirrors as a form of sort of pointing also just like Korean shamanistic traditions, and the mirror having so many sort of powers, so to speak, in terms of being a form of armor, being able to light one's travel into the spirit world, into other worlds. So
yeah. So I mean, the graphite rubbing, I think for me, it's kind of a similar gesture to what I was talking about earlier, where I try to visualize the untranslatable. I think for me, trying to visualize the erasure that occurs, you know, systemically and also linguistically and culturally. It's something I try to make somewhat tangible, but they're not tangible because they're rubbings. But I'm interested in like almost marking erasure of the thing itself. So like a lot of my erasures, whether it's with the drawings, like with the scores or with the video sculptures, they reference the exact same size of, you know, like in that room, for instance, yeah, the graphite rubbings are the exact same size as the two mirror video sculptures. And I think that there's a lot of things that go missing in the ways that history or institutionalization or, you know, these sort of like important documents, you know, a lot of these things leave out a lot of things, as we know. And so for me, trying to think of a way to sort of like honor the erased, like to remember the parts that are, you know, unwritten, or the parts that are like taken out, the parts that are erased, literally, like just, I think that erasure is really important to acknowledge. And so I use that as a way of actually acknowledging those things and trying to, I think visually, I'm really interested in sort of redacting the space like that you enter. So, you know, the graphite rubbings on the outside walls, you know, kind of like usher you into the space, and then you're met with the video sculptures with the mirrors, and that to me hopefully activates the room more like, you know, they become more like portals, and so the space reads a little different and breathes a little different. And then the formation with the mirror size, like the document size mirrors with the rocks, like I think the whole thing for me, and then the document size really references how, you know, it's sort of this like, you know, the document as this kind of container for bureaucratic or colonial narratives, and thinking of ways to reimagine or rewrite that with, you know, like you said, like my own like lexicon of clouds and grids and broken English, like literally like the alphabet falling apart and becoming abstraction and these other spaces. And yeah, I think for me, Buddhism and Korean shamanism, those are both things that I'm really interested in my own life to kind of think a lot about. And I was reading a lot of like Thich Nhat Hanh during the pandemic. I mean, we're still in it, but I'm really inspired by his writing about, and his teachings about like interbeing, like being, like we are the same as, basically, like if you see a piece of paper, how can you not see the clouds that created the rain, that you know, fed the trees, that became, that like someone went to go like chop down and then become a piece of paper and all of these things. But then he talked about how like basically you are a cloud, and you, like, we are all interbeing, we're interconnected with nature and connected with to each other. And I mean, I just think it's such a generous way of thinking, and it's something I'm trying to practice more. I don't think that I'm successfully doing it, but I want to. So it's I was thinking about a lot of those things, but also I think the rock formation, which actually is really interesting. I only realized this recently because I know I really felt the need to do the formation of them in a circle, like Sule. And but I just remember that recently, I think it was last year, I went to Marfa with a friend, and we're both on a residency, and we were in a house that was haunted, and they had so many ghosts, and we couldn't actually stay there unless we dealt with a ghost. So my friend, who's a very spiritual person, and he has a beautiful healing practice, and he meditated and asked his meditation what we should do, like, because we had nothing on us, like we didn't know what to do with it, you know. So we didn't know how to like deal with these ghosts or talk to them. And basically it told us to go get rocks from, you know, the land, and to get flowers from the land, and to offer it as a peace offering, and to also make formations with the rocks around the bed and around the building as a form of protection. And so we had to ask the curator, like, we need to drive out to like like Aga Canyon or something, and we need to all get rocks. And so we just like went searching for rocks and found ones that just spoke to us for some reason. And then before we put the rocks down, we were talking to the ghosts, and like a lot of the local people there told us you have to talk to them. And I thought that was so interesting because, prior to that, I think we just kind of thought like, oh, we need to like get rid of them or something. But you realize like, no, like this is where they live and I'm just like visiting, I'm actually invading their space. So we had this like little talk with them where we're like, hi, like my name is blah, blah, blah. I'm visiting for 10 days. I'm not here to disrespect you or your space. And so, here's like a peace offering, like here's some flowers for you from this place. And we're putting these rocks down. And, in return, we ask that you also respect us in our space. And like the moment we did that, the energy completely shifted and they stopped bothering us. And you knew they were there the whole time, but they just weren't like turning the lights on and off and going crazy like they did the first night we were there, which was like such a crazy experience. But I think the rock formation sort of kind of came from that experience, because I think that I know that rocks have this beautiful like energy where they can protect, and the formation you form with them can also do that. And so I think when I talked about this kind of interiority of language, or language feeling safe, or like trying to get it to feel safe, I think in that installation it felt really just natural to want to have that formation. I think that came from there, now that I think, now that I've had time to think about it. But so yeah, it's sort of kind of going in that direction. And also rocks always reminds me of like my grandmother, the one that I talked about, who was a folk dancer, and she literally lived at a Buddhist temple for like 30 years before she passed. And she was always like, the Korean temples always have like these huge rock staircases, and everything is like just surrounded by nature. And so yeah, I think it just kind of all came together that way.
Yeah, wow, thank you for sharing your ghost story.
I have many, but yeah.
And yeah, I loved the way that, just as you said, the way that room came together and that work came together was, of course there was so much planning involved, but we didn't really know what the final formation would be, how it would look until you got there, which, for me as a curator, thinking spatially, just like yourself, was so important to have you here, which we weren't sure was going to happen because of the pandemic. And it was so, yeah, it seemed so innate because it was so quick. And the minute you walked in, you knew exactly what you wanted to do, which was really exciting. And
yeah, I remember I was like, Heather, please hold off on writing about that room, because I have to physically come and just like channel some shit. Like I was like, I don't know.
Yeah. And when you walked in, you were like, it's gonna get witchy in here, which was, yeah, really nice. That felt like a dream for sure. So I'm glad that we were able to make that happen.
Trusting me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. But you mentioned, your lexicon and syntax and the mere documents, holding space for that. And you mentioned the Unraveled Alphabet. This is the foundation of how I think about your scores, which are your drawings, which is this unraveled alphabet you use Times New Roman, and create these beautiful sort of scores that hold like repetition. They hold half full and crescent moons. They hold sort of redacted watermarks from bureaucratic documents. And yeah, they're very abstracted. And I've thought a lot about scores and what they can be and what they are and what they look like. And we worked with an artist, at the end of last year at TPW, whose project was predicated around a score. And it was, of course, very different from yours, in that it was sort of like a written text that was very instructive, like hold this chime, walk to this space, and then do this. And or in many ways yours in a way, or sometimes I think of them as being more literal in terms of like a musical score, in terms of musical scores are, just a bunch of symbols that, musicians understand. Anyway, so maybe you could talk a bit about that and talk about, so much of your work is based in video sculptures and is like video collage, but also very much about like, drawing. So maybe you could talk about that, the materiality of that.
I love graphite so much because I think that what I love about it is that you can also erase it. It's not permanent. And I think it's so, it's such a kind of a common material that we all know, like we all had a pencil at some point. But yeah, like the pencil being this thing we learned how to write with, you know, and like it was, it's just like, I feel like when I trace it to my memory, which I'm hoping, I don't know if people now feel that with like a pencil when when you think of like learning how to write a language, and it's usually with a pencil. And I love that. And also when it's written in a weird way, it's archival. Like it, you know, it's like more archival than other certain pens, but then if you erase it, it's just completely gone. So I like that tension of like how it's really tangible and intangible, which I think something my work is always thinking about. And then like the scores. And so when I decided to do drawings where I'm really trying to like do my unlanguaging process, which is, you know, my own sort of term that I came up with to describe unfixing language itself. And in this case, it's the English language, because I'm really interested in, you know, how do you, you know, thinking of ways to decenter the world's most dominant language. And so how I began to do that is by using an English stencil, which happens to be in a Times New Roman font, and that I just bought online, and it's just like for kids and stuff like that. And I use that I basically misuse it to not write English, but to write, to find ways to make some sort of abstract space through misusing this English stencil. And so, yeah, I was really interested in thinking of, I guess, sort of a new trajectory for what it means to be legible, but also this sort of like semiotic visual play of abstracting language to become something else. And the more I drew them, it actually felt like sort of a channeling of something where I feel like it kind of creates these spaces that to me feel like, actually the drawings also kind of feel like portals to me. And I always layer them, and they're transparent, and I layer them, and I also fold and pin and create these spaces that feel more sculptural within the drawing itself. And some of them I think actually do look like portals in a way. But I also wanted to make my own grid paper, because rather than relying on the existing system of, you know, like language grid paper, I wanted to make a sort of other new grid. And there's a few, I've been using bureaucratic watermark prints to make my own patterns out of them. And so each time I'm sort of retranslating and reiterating it into new abstraction. So that became the grid for the scores. And I began to think of them as scores because I think that I actually was thinking, instead of thinking like, oh, I'm going to draw language, I was actually always thinking of score in a fluxus sort of sense. I actually really love the whole tradition of fluxus, and, you know, thinking of ways to score something as abstract as, you know, language or broken language or the untranslatable space. And I think that, you know, other fluxus people like Namjoon Paik or John Cage or all these people like have played with the score in an experimental sense. And so for me, it was sort of that kind of fluxus way of looking at language, but extending it into my own visual language. Yeah, and also throughout the drawings, I actually, after I draw it, I constantly erase through them so that it feels, again, like I like being able to visualize the erasure. And I think that, you know, it's important to acknowledge what is erased. And so while I do that, I think it also creates some sort of like pathway where things feel more, it feels transparent and opaque at the same time. And it's just kind of the different things I think flow through it. So it's become part of the visual language, I think, for the scores.
And you have two scores that are going to be shown sort of outside of the gallery space, taking over billboard spaces. And you asked for billboards that are in the sky rather than billboards that are maybe next to a parking lot or against a building. So they are two billboards that we found next to each other that are at the top of a building. There's nothing behind them. Like there's trees in the distance. So they are set against the sky, which I thought was such a lovely request and such a nice, you know, works so nicely with your practice, of course, in terms of pointing to the celestial and the earthly. Yeah, how are you sort of, like, maybe share your thinking on that, or how you feel about having those sort of like publicly outdoors, like sort of for the first time?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the fact that they are for the public, because I always love being able to, see art out in the world and outside of like a white cube. And I also really like the fact that billboards typically represent a very legible space, and it's like literally supposed to be as legible as possible so that like it grabs people's attention and sends a message. And I really liked the idea of putting the abstracted scores, the score for unlanguaging, on billboards, because then it becomes, it's like, what are you doing putting up illegible words on a billboard? And to put it against the sky, I mean, the sky thing just felt so natural. Like when you guys offered me the billboard project, I immediately just knew that it had to be against an open sky. And I think that, like you said so wonderfully in the essay, maybe it is because it feels like some sort of like song for the moon or a song to the celestial, that it felt like I wanted just it to be open and just like in a space that feels really open and yeah, like empty of whatever else, I guess. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I've always loved that too, about public art, and especially about billboards, which are, hyper visible, and it against anyone's will, essentially. It's part of, people are engaging with it, unlike, yes, the white cube, where that's a very specific audience of folks who make the choice to, enter a, contemporary art space. So I've always loved that about this, and I'm, really excited to like hear feedback and from folks. I mean, another thing that's difficult about like billboard projects and public art projects is hard to, I can't talk to folks about it in the same way that I can when they come to the gallery. I can't stop people at Dufon and Dufferin in their cars to ask them what they think about this, which would be nice. But yes, I love, just as you said, I love that about the public space of art. And also, just to go back to the gallery, just maybe to finish up this talk about the scores, is that I love that when you do walk into the gallery, the first thing that you see is one of Jesse's scores that is document size, and then the next one is this really lovely sort of longer vertical one that I really think sets such a lovely tone for the exhibition in terms of this unraveled language, this untranslatability, this abstraction, and then you have the documents and the sort of vertical scroll shape, sort of giving you all these lovely hints as to what's to come. So I love that. But maybe sort of to wrap things up, maybe we could talk about UNESCO. So you are currently right now in Paris doing a residency, and you are doing research on UNESCO, and you're continuing your sort of investigation into tangible and intangible heritage. UNESCO, this sort of like global force, does have a relationship that you mentioned earlier with Gangang Shule. It is considered Korean intangible heritage. And Jesse, we've talked a lot about, this sort of UNESCO and these colonial forces and this need to sort of like know and understand, and similar to what Emily Apter is getting at in Against World Literature, is to sort of like homogenize and claim. And so, you're sort of investigating, this relationship that UNESCO has with this, cultural tradition, dance and song that's traditional to Korea. And so, maybe you could just talk a little bit about that and that research that you're doing. And while the exhibition at TPW doesn't point to UNESCO specifically, it's still kind of there to unpack it for folks who are, more researched on sort of the nuances of your practice. So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I'm here right now working on my next film, which is about, it's funny because I feel like Gangang Sule is kind of walking, it's like it dances across multiple projects and it just keeps going. And it's just like, I feel like sometimes the research just leads you there. Like I wasn't even planning on all of this, but after making Sule and then using Gangang Sule as sort of a metaphor against these colonial narratives and ways to kind of rewrite that, I began to look at kind of going back to this bureaucratic structure that holds these narratives, and how UNESCO, for instance, Gangang Sule is validated as South Korea's intangible heritage. And the whole concept of intangible heritage is just so absurd and funny, like to, institutionalize something intangible. Like, how do you even do that? And so, yeah, I've been going to the archives here. I did some extensive research and finally got in touch with an archivist who has been super gracious to me, and just also happens to be actually happens to be Asian Canadian. She's from Vancouver, but she lives in Paris. And so we got to have some really great conversations about sort of trying to trace this intangible thing that also feels so personal, because it's something I've been making work about, but it's also something I've been thinking about in terms of like, even I've been thinking of family also as like intangible heritage, like all these things that, bureaucracy does not validate as important. Like, like for instance, like my late grandmother, like she was not documented as like an intangible heritage by UNESCO, but to me, she holds equal weight, and, the way all these things are become part of you. And so, yeah, I've been trying to understand that. And so I finally located the file. I mean, the archivist helped me locate the file basically. And we found out that it's confidential and we can't open this folder until like 50 years from now. And so I told her that I would still like to film the box that we can't open, or the folder that we can't open. So today I got to do that, which was super strange because it felt incredibly futile to see this beautiful dance that I've been like making work about as a piece of paper in this folder that I can't open, in a box that it just says archive on it. And yeah, I mean, there's something so that makes you so existential, right? About bureaucracy. It's like, this is all like, it just filters people and things and the intangible down to this like tangible number, or like a thing on paper, or words on paper. And it's just, so yeah, I've been dealing with that and what that means. And translation becomes also linguistic hierarchy is part of that, because for UNESCO, for every culture to be validated into intangible heritage, you have to submit your documents in English or French only. And thinking about how those are the imperial languages, and how French being that before English. So yeah, I'm here trying to unpack all of those things and how all of that's entangled personally, and I guess just on a collective level. But yeah, I'm still trying to understand what that means. But yeah, it's super strange to think about the tension between the untranslatable and the translatable, and the intangible, and I guess maybe the tangible, but I don't know if it ever becomes so tangible.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating to hear about, this work that you've been working on as we've been working together. But yeah, I'm really excited to hear about, where this goes and see what happens there. I think you mentioned that you were thinking that this video, or maybe it was a video you already made, would be a little bit more like narrative, because all of your, your videos and your video sculptures are very much sort of like non-linear, non-narrative. So is that true? And how do you sort of kind of envision that, or work through those two things? I think my understanding of your practice is that this sort of like non-linearity, non-narrativity, I can say that it's kind of quite natural for you in terms of work and think. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so sure that even if I say it'll be narrative, it won't ever be like
right.
narrative. Like, I'm sure it'll be all like fucked up in some sense. But I do think it's sort of, I jokingly have been calling it like a documentary about documents to my friends, but it's like, I have no idea. I think I'm sure it's going to be a more abstract read into these things. And also kind of, I plan on really kind of playing with subtitles and that sort of space in terms of that cinematic language. But yeah, I mean, I have no idea. Like, I feel like I can always say it'll be something, but
yeah,
I feel like one thing I've learned making work is that it's gonna just lead you and you just go wherever it takes you. So I have no idea what I'm gonna make.
Yeah, of course. And I love that about your practice. It's all very sort of process-based and intuitive. So yeah, we will have to watch for that. A documentary about documents.
Documentary in the most non-documentary sense, because I'm so not a,
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll leave it there. It's quite late now for you in Paris. So yeah, thank you so much for your time for this. And anyone watching this who has any questions, please just reach out to us at TPW. It's heather@gallerytpw.ca. And Jessie, I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.